Are we online?
Yes.
Hello, welcome to our Bússola Tech webinar on the Let's Tech agenda. My name is Luís Kimaid. I'm the CEO of Bússola Tech. As you already know, we are following a thread discussing how does it look like a virtual parliament. We saw that many legislative houses in Brazil have adapted their legislative process to function in a virtual mode. Today, actually, we have 101 legislative houses in Brazil using this methodology to deliberate. All of them are using this new tool on deliberations on the floor, on the plenary. None of them are yet using this for selected committees discussions. Of these legislative houses, we have 78 houses as city councils. We have 21 as state assemblies, and we have both houses of parliament using these tools. Actually, when we discuss remote deliberation, we only have 3 legislative houses in Brazil actually using a remote deliberation system properly developed for this purpose. It is the Brazilian Senate, the House of Commons, and the City Council of São Paulo. They have built a solution which considers aspects in their architecture of security, of integrating their internal regulations, and how would transparency and participation dynamics would work as well. So our webinar today is to discuss how does it look like to change these dynamics from a traditional legislative house that works in a similar mode for centuries and to a virtual mode deliberation system. Actually, we did not have a process for this change. It actually happened in a very short period of time, meaning we did not have the time to understand what kind of consequences we have to implement during this period. We have to understand the internal regulations of legislative houses, for example. They are built over many years of debates and discussions to accommodate different points of view in terms of our society. The legislative houses are the houses responsible for the plural representation of society, meaning how can we adapt a regulation that has been built for an offline dynamic into an online dynamic. Today, for this discussion, we are honored to welcome Professor Cristina Leston-Bandeira from University of Leeds. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luís, and thank you very much for having me.
We also have Fabio Almeida Lopes. He is the political advisor of Bússola Tech and a public servant in the House of Commons in Brazil for over 10 years. Welcome, Fabio.
Hi, Luís. Hi, Professor. Very happy to be here.
Professor Leston-Bandeira, I do have some points to start, but before I start, I should make the proper comments on the person responsible for introducing you to this discussion with us in Brazil. I'd like to thank Thales Quintão. He is currently studying at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. But in regard to our discussion, as I shared, in Brazil we have 101 legislative houses using different forms of remote deliberation systems. Although only 3 of them are systems specially developed to this goal, all of them are focusing their attention to the floor. What are the challenges of trying to implement the work of the committees virtually?
Thank you very much, Luís, for that question. And thank you very much again for inviting me and for Thales to make that connection. I'm always really happy to speak to Brazil and Brazilians where I've had many connections for a long time, exactly because of the issues of digital and Parliament. That's always been my main connections to Brazil, and when I visited before. And that's a really good question. I think there are lots of reasons why parliaments have focused mainly on the floor, on the chamber, on the plenary. And those reasons are very much linked really with the legitimacy of parliaments, in that the symbolism of parliament quite often is the chamber, is the plenary. That's what people usually recognize. People usually don't actually quite often probably realise that parliaments have committees that do work in committees. And so for symbolic reasons and for legitimacy reasons, the chamber is what represents a parliament. So because of that, most parliaments, all parliaments, I think, the ones that I know of, have focused mainly on the chamber, on how to do how to portray to the country, how to say we're still here, we're still scrutinizing policy, we're still here representing you. And that's really important. And that's really a symbolic legitimacy type of role that they're performing there. On the other hand, also, the chamber is where you see the collective of all the parliamentarians, isn't it? Of all the representatives. So whether you've elected 500 representatives, 700, 200, the place where you can see them all is in the chamber. So again, that it is the only place really in a parliament that represents the whole of the whole parliament. However, having said that, I mean, it's understandable. There's lots of reasons for the focus on the chamber. And in my view, I think that's where it should be the starting point, to try to see how can parliaments work in that context. On the other hand, I think there's an issue here which is also important to bear in mind, which I think sometimes we forget when we're talking about virtual parliaments, which I've been talking quite a bit recently, which is the fact that these virtual parliaments, they have emerged in the context of crisis. And that's really important. And it's the crisis that has led to consequences, a crisis that has acted as a motivation for change. And whenever there's a crisis, what you do is you're trying to tackle the crisis as best as you can, and you don't necessarily think of everything properly. You don't necessarily think of all the details. And so what different parliaments have done is react, say, right, okay, we've got an issue here, what shall we do? And as part of that, I'll give you the example of the UK House of Commons. So that's the lower chamber in the UK. And actually, I don't know if you're aware of that, but there, the first virtual meetings and deliberations were not from the main chamber. They were the committees. So in the UK, in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, actually, the first meetings were in the first meeting, sort of parliamentary business between MPs, were at the committee level. So there was what we call a recess. So recess is a period when Parliament is not sitting, which coincided with Easter here. So Parliament would not be sitting anyway. And what the committees did was they saw there's a crisis here. You know, there's lots of issues to do with health, lots of issues with people losing their jobs and all of those things, lots of problems that it's where you need Parliament. And what we saw, it was really interesting because we saw the committees reacting to that, and the chairs of the committees actually intervening in those spaces. So for instance, you have the chair of the Health Select Committee, so the Health Committee, having hearings with key politicians from the government on health, or key officials on health. And that's actually interesting because it shows that committees, in some ways, they are more flexible. You know, they should be more flexible. It should be easier for committees to meet online than it is for chamber. There should be smaller units, you know, simpler type of activities. But coming back to my first point in terms of crisis, it's about how you react from crisis to a crisis. And so I think what we've seen, and it's really interesting to see how different parliaments across the world have reacted to this. It's just you react to that crisis and you think and you try to tackle it how best you can. And in the case of the UK House of Commons, they actually started by the committees. Now, coming back to the Brazilian case, obviously you all know the Brazilian case far better than I do, but I've been following the Brazilian parliament, both chambers, since 2009, more or less. And I can tell you without the shadow of a doubt that the Brazilian Congress, in terms of digital applications and integration of digital, you know, obviously there's lots of problems with it, but in terms of capacity and capability of digital is miles ahead to many other parliaments across the world. So I don't know the specific case of the state legislatures in Brazil, but to have the two main chambers, so the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, operating at that level, in some ways is almost unfair compared to other state legislatures, because they are well ahead if you compare to other parliaments all across the world. And I'm sorry, I took a long time, and I can say more about committees. In the end, I only said a little bit, but if you want to follow that up, that's fine.
Professor, if I may, you mentioned that this discussion is already on the House of Commons and the House of Lords. To our audience, we have a particularity here. For example, this would be the equivalent to the House of Representatives in Brazil and the Brazilian Senate. But with one particularity, the House of Lords is not elected. Did you notice a different level of resistance to the implementation of a virtual deliberation system between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, or they acted in the same manner?
That's a really interesting point, because you'd expect that, but I'm not sure you can actually say that. There was, because in the UK House of Commons, it is actually a very traditional type of chamber, traditional parliament, and you have a sort of a set of MPs who actually resisted to moving virtual, and that's why the UK House of Commons, actually, it's not fully virtual. It's hybrid system. So they adapted the chamber so that MPs can sit in the chamber. There's place for 50 MPs and socially distant between each other. And then you have MPs who join in virtually. So most MPs are joining in virtually, but some are joining in there. And that actually has raised quite a few difficulties and issues, because there's the argument that if you're not in the chamber, you're not able to do the debate as well. You're not able to follow it up as well. And just this week, we've had some interesting interventions, for instance, from our MPs who are in Scotland, which is quite far away from London, and there's no flights now between Scotland and London, so they just can't go to London, and they feel quite detached from everything. And from their perspective, it should be fully online, so they would be all in the same conditions. But now there's like a two-tier type of participation. Now in the Lords, there's obviously issues in there, in that, I don't know if you're aware, but obviously it's not an elected chamber. So what you have there is mainly experts, people who have a whole life of expertise in different areas. As a consequence of that, you are talking of quite an elderly type of MP or parliamentarians. And although we know that technology is not a question of age, it doesn't always help neither. So there have been issues about, but also, the fact that they are a frail type of a group of parliamentarians, so more susceptible to be affected by COVID-19 also. So there's all sorts of safety issues in there. So interestingly, the laws actually are moving more towards fully virtual because of the safety issues, whereas the Commons are very insistent on the hybrid movement model. And this week, actually, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, I've lost track of the days, but the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's like the equivalent sort of the Minister of Parliamentary Affairs, let's say, represents the government in there, he said that Parliament should go back to normal after this current break. So from the 1st of June, from June when they come back, they should go back to normal business, which has raised all sorts of questions from the opposition, saying how is that going to be possible? But again, it's because of the pressure of that small group of MPs who actually do want to meet face-to-face and do not want to meet virtually.
Perfect, Professor. Fabio, starting from this point that Professor just shared, she mentioned that the House of Commons is a hybrid model, both with MPs on the floor, physically, and also virtually. We saw the House here in Brazil also decided to have a hybrid session. Is there an internal regulation reason for this decision?
Very interesting question, Luis. Yes, actually there is. The very first section in the internal regulations in Brazil, in the lower house. It specifies that the meetings should be held on the building where the chamber is located, unless the majority of the members decide to meet elsewhere. So it's important. There is a twofold answer there. It's important that this section is not ignored. So the president, the speaker in Brazil, we call him president, must be there, or the person presiding over the session must be there, and it's granted access to any member who wants to be there, respected the social isolation, of course. But there is room for maybe over 100, maybe close to 150 members if they want to be physically in the space of the chamber. So
perfect.
There is this more law side of the answer, but there is also a more political and representational side of the answer, which is it's very important for, as the professor said earlier, for people to see Parliament working, and people will connect the image of the physical space of Parliament with the chamber, with the plenary. So it's important that the sessions are held there, and the Parliament, even if the members are not physically there, but the session is happening at that space, and people who are following the sessions can see it happening there.
Perfect, Fabio. When you mentioned that the Speaker of the House is in the floor chairing the debates, what other MPs are coming to the floor as well? You mentioned that all MPs that wish to do so are able in terms of the regulation, but politically, which members are actually going to the floor for the debate, and which members are staying virtually? Because we have 513 members. So can you share a little bit on this regard as well?
Yes. Well, we have the equivalent, or the closest equivalent of the whips here, which we call the leaders, and the leaders of each party has a leader. Most of the leaders are coming to Brasilia every other week, maybe not every week, but every other week, to participate in negotiations, which are much easier done face to face. And besides the leaders, there is also the rapporteurs. Usually, when you have a very complex matter, it's the rapporteur is the person to go when you want to have a more detailed debate or detailed questions and definitions in the draft of the bill. So the rapporteurs of the most polemic bills are coming also to Brasilia. Of course, there are a few others who want to be here. Well, there are members who live in Brasilia, not only the Brasilia elected members, but there are a few other members who live in Brasilia, so they usually go. But also there is the age safety threshold there. So there are a few who are leaders or rapporteurs or live in Brasilia who opt to not go physically to the chamber because of their risk group, because they are in the risk group.
Perfect, Fabio. We are discussing about the regulation per se. You mentioned that the first article of the regulation is one of the reasons for the session to be hybrid. And when we consider, let's say, we are discussing COVID-19 crisis, should take a while to fully normalize life in society. Specialists are not yet sure how long it will take for life to go back to normal, or what will normal look like. So, if we are keeping the parliament virtually, what kind of changes do you see as essential to the internal regulations of the House so it can properly function in this new virtual mode?
Well, Luis, it's a very complex question. I'll try to to tackle it in some different aspects here. The first one, and I think it's the most important one, is to see the regulations as a tool for the political process that is happening in the Congress. So the most important change should address the political aspects of the process, and the first one would be ways to promote the participation, either from the citizen, the individual citizen interested in some bill that is being evaluated in Congress, or the civil society in an organized form, an NGO, or a company who is following a specific bill, or the lobby, or the Brazilian equivalent of lobby, because as we do not have a regulation, proper regulation for lobby. We call it a different way here. We call it governmental relations, but it's basically the same. So I think the change should address the participation first. So tools that would help people keep following the debates, keep following the parliamentary work, and keep making contact with the parliamentarians, because that's the biggest challenge, I think, to help people, because the Congress and parliaments everywhere work as a hub for people to meet and to decide politically. That comes from the Agora in old Athens. So we've lost this physical Agora, and now we have to look for a more virtual Agora that helps people to connect with others interested in the same subject, either to debate and confront their arguments, or to have colleagues to support their same ideas. So there is this biggest challenge, I think. And the other one, very specific to the political process, is the interaction between parliamentarians. The tools, as they work now, they are not very effective to promote what we see in everyday life in parliaments, which is the Congress person is here, and he just walks 2 steps to the side and have a meeting with another parliamentarian, and they exchange information and promote, for example, unrests below their leaders. That's very common. Oh, let's vote against that, despite the leaders saying it's important. So that's not happening right now. Leaders are really strong. Leaders are strong always, but now are stronger, because they now the president can only talk to so many parliamentarians at once, and he will focus on leaders, hoping that the leaders will have the support of their group. So right now there is no tool, no system online that could help 513 people to talk to each other, simulating the space that we have either in the committee or in the plenary. So I think that's a big challenge that must be addressed in the near future if we are to keep, and I think we will keep, some sort of hybrid deliberation for the years to come. And just so I can talk a little bit about the more technical aspects. It reflects in the use of time, use of the right to talk in Parliament, which is very important. So can you imagine the speaker with 513 little windows with faces choosing who will talk next? Of course, there are a few systems in action that will help him, but there are points of order, for example. It's very difficult for him to see someone raising a hand to to raise a point of order if he has 513 little windows there. So there's a few issues that should be addressed in the near future, because I do think we will keep on the hybrid format for maybe 1 year, 1 year and a half.
Can I come in there now? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it was really interesting, Fabio, to hear all of that, because it's so interesting to compare with the discussions here in the UK and other places like Canada. I had a seminar a few weeks ago with the Canadian Parliament and with the Australian Parliament. And those issues about choosing who speaks and who doesn't speak are so important and so crucial, because as you say, it's physically, it is really difficult, and technically it is really difficult to try to bring in, say, 513 members, or in the UK, 650 members. So you have to select one way or another. And that selection, it can be very problematic. And one of the things that a lot of parliaments have done has been by going by the leaders, as you say. So what would be the whips here, but the leaders of the parliamentary groups, and there's quite a few parliaments that have done that, which makes sense in those systems. In the UK, that would be absolutely unacceptable, because the backbenchers have got such a strong voice, they would never accept have someone speaking for the parliament. So that's really difficult. And then you have the system about how do you select, and then how are you inclusive? How do you make sure you are inclusive? For instance, you're more likely to have, say, women parliamentarians or even male parliamentarians with young children, who are the ones who stay at home. So the ones who will not be traveling, or the ones who are further away who will not be traveling. So there's issues of inclusivity and being fair to everyone, which are really serious, and about how to choose that. And that's been very clear in this country. And then the other part I thought it was really interesting, you're saying about how do basically do politics, sort of, it's the informal contacts, isn't it? Because politics is not just about the formality of the process, it's about those informal chats, about meeting someone in a cafe or meeting there and having a word here and there. And all of that, obviously, you lose by going virtual. And it's really difficult to reproduce. Now, I think MPs are still doing that in general with things like WhatsApp. So they're starting to use that type of tools and do those conversations. But there are lots of problems with that too, because then you have like bubbles and people just talk between themselves and polarize. And those issues are exactly the same here. You miss out on those informal contacts, and the point of selection is a really important one. And you know, the spontaneity you lose, as you say, if someone has a point of order. How can you capture that? How can you capture an intervention to bring that into the debate? So you definitely lose a lot of the normal politics.
Yeah, just on your last point on WhatsApp, particularly in Brazil with the leaks, the constant leaks, it's also a risk. Lots of politicians are not willing to take to use this kind of tool. So whether you would have a meeting with 3 or 4 people easily reproduced in a WhatsApp group, but now with screen printing and leaks, people are avoiding to have this group for more sensitive matters.
It's interesting to complement. For example, as I mentioned, most of houses in Brazil, 98 of the ones that implemented virtual deliberation, most of them are using WhatsApp groups to record the votings. So since Either the voting is visual, so you have the image of the member saying, I vote yes, I vote no, or it's over a WhatsApp group, because they are using commercially available tools. And it's interesting to notice, for example, the Senate in Brazil has gone totally virtual. And you can see on the little screens, we have 81 senators. One senator picks the phone and it rings, and you see the other senator picking the phone as well, and they start to talk over the mute. So, although we did not consider these on the architecture of this virtual house, people are adapting. They are using other ways outside the system to adapt to this new reality. But as you mentioned, for example, how civil society will engage with members in this way if they don't have the content of the member. If we have an open parliament, civil society or an enterprise can go physically to the parliament and put their point of view physically in person. But when we are virtually, how can you do this? How can you democratize this? With this thread, I would like to go to my next question to Professor Cristina. Professor Cristina, as Fabio mentioned, we are having some difficulties on keeping some of these dynamics. For example, the right to speak on the floor. Here in Brazil, it's common for you, for example, you don't want to see that voting going forward on that particular day. You start to making a series of point of orders to spend all the time of the session discussing point of order, and you don't have time to vote. Or as some members share with me, Luís, on the virtual parliament, I cannot start to scream in the middle of the floor to ask for the floor. So I cannot get a place to speak outside my turn as I would have normally. So, Professor Cristina, which parliamentary dynamics should we try to replicate on remote deliberation systems? And which dynamics we shouldn't move to virtual?
Yeah, when you mentioned that question, I wasn't quite sure what you meant by which one we should move to virtual, because in my view, virtual should never be a substitute to face-to-face. Virtual is always a means to enable the face-to-face, to give more potential, to develop the potential of face-to-face. So it's about enhancing what we can do in face-to-face. And to me, virtual digital, it's about that. And it should never be about substituting. So I think that any dynamic, any activities can go to virtual and should go to virtual if they work well. But I suspect you might be referring to sort of activities that maybe are not necessarily, don't necessarily enhance politics, and maybe those should not be reproduced online. But I think that comes with human nature, doesn't it? And in terms of how people communicate and how people do politics, is very much about the human nature and the culture of the country and the context of the country. And so what they're likely to try to do is to reproduce the same behavior online. But what they'll probably find is that some of those behaviors, they're not so very easy to do online for the reasons we were saying before. So those informal reactions, more spontaneous reactions, they're really difficult to do online. And so in some ways, online brings more structure to political debate, more structure to processes, more systematicity. But that doesn't mean, so in some ways it's more ordered, there's more order to it, there's more logic to it, but it doesn't mean that you don't lose a lot of things out of that. If we think of the most serious authoritarian regimes we've had in history, a lot of them have a lot of order and structure, and it doesn't mean that they are necessarily better. They might be very efficient, but they might not necessarily be more representative or legitimate of the people. So by going online, you lose those things. But then also what we see is that with time, people adapt to those processes. So Fabio was referring to earlier how people have adapted in their use of WhatsApp, for instance, how, just a few months ago, a couple of years ago, it was so much used, and now people are reacting to that and moving to different platforms and doing things in a different way. And I suspect, particularly if we're talking about having this system, as Fabio is saying, for another year or a year and a half, which is interesting that you say that, because as I said earlier, the UK, in a couple of weeks, they want to go back to normal, which everyone is a bit shocked, thinking, how on earth is that going to happen? But if we do have another year and a half of this hybrid stroke virtual system, people will find ways of adapting to that. One thing that I find really interesting in Brazil, and when you're saying in there about that member talked about, I can just go and shout and talk about it, is the chamber. When the first time I went to the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies and I watched how the chamber works, I was just fascinated, because to me it was like a market, like a fair, uma feira, mercado. It was just, no one was sitting down, everyone's standing up, they're all talking to each other. No one was listening to the person who was speaking on as doing the speech, and everyone was just talking to each other, and they were clearly doing what Fabio was saying earlier, doing business, talking between themselves, making decisions, asking about what's next stage and all of that. And that might not look great, but that's the way that they clearly do the politics. So they have to find another way of doing that in the current context, because that's how the culture is. Now, this was back in 2013, I think. I went back again this year, past summer, in 2019, by the very kind invitation of INCT, the Digital Democracy Center for Technology based in Salvador, with links in Ceará in Brasilia. And then this time, I was shocked with the way members use their own phones within the chamber. So you have the phenomenon of deputies filming themselves with a phone from within the chamber and making declarations. So that's almost like the other way around, isn't it? You have a face-to-face space process which has been invaded by the digital tool. So it's the other way around. And that's interesting too. So does that mean now that, and apologies, there's some noise going through here. Does that mean now that I'd be really interested to hear how are members now using those systems, the YouTubers and all of that? Is that now being developed completely separate from the Parliament, from the Congress? Because if that's happening, then that's a bit dangerous in itself, because there's a parallel process to the institution, and it becomes so detached from the institution that it's not even using the space in there. So although I wouldn't necessarily advocate those ways of doing politics, because I think there's a lot of noise and people don't really know what's going on, I'm wondering whether, with going virtual, whether some of those processes have abated and they're not happening. But what is definitely true is that the informal side of politics is very, very difficult to keep it online, and anything to do with informal channels needs to really be pushed, proactively activated and support people. One thing we haven't spoken about at all, I don't know if we're going to speak about that at all, is the staff, the parliamentary staff, because presumably you have also parliamentary staff working at home. And how are they being included into everything? How are they being included into the decisions? How do they know what's going on? And if some people are on site, how are they being selected? So it's all those informal informal procedures, dynamics that are really difficult to reproduce online unless you actively promote them, unless you actively pursue them.
I'd like to jump in.
Just before this, you make the comments, I'd like to ask all of you guys that are watching us that you should, if you are liking our debate, send us the emoticons. It's just over the screen. And feel free to pose your questions. We are here to debate with you as well. Fabio, would you like to comment Professor's comments?
Yes, actually, quite a few interesting points Professor Cristina addressed in this question. I'll try to remember them all. Well, the first one is, yes, definitely there are a few things that maybe are better left out of the virtual environment, because Brazilian Congress is usually a very convoluted space in politics. So there are a few, I remember a few, quite a few situations. For example, people dressed with gowns to make a protest, parliamentarians, I mean, inside the chamber, raising plaques. There was a time it was almost daily. Well, there was a moment where one of the parliamentarians recorded with his phone his vote and posted his vote as he was voting in the system. So there are a few things that should be left, should better be left out of the of the virtual or hybrid system in the near future. But as Professor said, part of it is the cultural environment of Brazilian politics that is reproduced in the chamber or in the Senate. So it's important to have a more institutional way to have this conversation, at least those who are really institutional, in their proper channels. Else you lose record of most of what happens in the parliament, because what happens in a session you can summarize in a few lines, but there is a lot of other things going on in the more representative. It's the House of Representatives in the end. So the representation of people, for example, when they congratulate someone from their constituencies, or when they address a more provincial problem in the national arena that resonates with a lot of other constituencies in the country. So this kind of situation is lost, is basically lost when you only focus on the order of the day, order of business. And that's another interesting aspect. Nowadays, you only vote what has a high level of consensus, because as the tools are not yet completely appropriate for a more intense in debate configuration, like successive roll calls. They are very tiresome. So they try to focus on those votes which are which have a more which have a higher level of consensus. And we have a counter example of this very week, when the executive order was not voted because it was too polemic in Congress about the Amazon lands, the sale of Amazon lands from the Brazilian government to private. So there was, at some point, the speaker said, well, it's impossible to keep going. It's too problematic, this question. It should require a more intensive and face-to-face debate. We can't have it now, so we won't keep going. So there is this, we are learning. It's a learning curve, and we are still on the very small part of the learning curve so far. So there are these lots of questions to be addressed before we can move or to feel comfortable with this complex process in a virtual or mostly virtual environment. And a very just to congratulate on the very interesting point. I'm myself someone who believes in process, in the due process, and defends the legislative process, despite in Brazil it's sometimes just disregarded due to the political process. But I have to abide to this very good reminder that Professor Cristina said, that the most efficient authoritarian governments were very strict in due process. And the last point that you mentioned, and on the staff side, very interesting. The staff that advise to the speaker, we call it the Secretaria Geral da Mesa. They are almost full on the plenary as before. The people who went to the plenary before are still going, because well, there are still some parts of the jobs who are to be taken there. For example, if the speaker has to answer a point of order, the people who advises him on answering points of order must be there, the clerk, but not only the clerk. Well, a few people have to be there. But every party also has a body, we call it leadership here, and the leadership has some staff that are still physically going to Parliament, and they have, well, they have the burden of being there and the risk associated, but they also have the best insight of what's really going on, because the interaction between the staff, the party staff, is very important in the process as well. So it's interesting for them, but also is a risk. And they are the party staff is more limited, has a more limited access to the house, but they are still going. There are some of them who are still going.
Very interesting. Thank you,
Fabio. I would like to take a step back with you. You've been a public servant in the House for over a decade. So we are discussing how members are adapting and using different technologies on information and communication for information and communication purpose. So members usually associate the use of technology with their obligation to communicate with their constituents. Meaning the debate about technology is centralized on social media platforms, as Professor Cristina mentioned earlier. When the use of technology moves to improve the effectiveness of the legislative process, members usually associate it with the loss of their power to decide. I mean, over the past years, I think you can give us a few examples of how the House has been changing its process for digitalizing, for improving transparency, to give more participation, even through the implementation of artificial intelligence. For example, I just saw Marcos de Vitaresi. He's also a public servant up in the House. He's here with us. And he is responsible for implementing an AI initiative in the House called Ulysses. Fabio, how can we overcome this paradigm and show how technology can help members to make better choice, and to show them we do not want to replace them, but to improve their effectiveness?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. It's not an easy one. In my view, Luis, Brazilian Congress as an institution has been an early adopter of technology. If you remember or recall in the 90s, Brazilian Congress already had a very interesting internet site. Right when the open data movement started in the world, the Brazilian Congress had started an open data initiative, which today, for example, you have access to literally everything that happens in Congress, in Brazilian Congress, through this open data source. For example, if you want to see any vote taken in Parliament in the last maybe 20 years, it's there. If you want to see what's happening right now, for example, which committees are holding, not today, but before the COVID and the pandemics, which committees were holding meetings, what was the order of the day in the plenary, and for example, if there was a specific bill being debated in plenary, in which stage of the process it was online all the time. So to the extreme limit of a very specific vote being held in the next 5 minutes, it will be there for you to see what's happening, who is against, who is in favor, what was the vote in the end, how each party voted, how each people from each of the states voted. So it's really, really interesting how open and how digital the Brazilian Congress is. For example, there is the app, the mobile app InfoLeg, which it's also a very advanced tool in this regard. So despite saying all that, nothing or barely nothing of it affected or influenced directly on the parliamentarian life. That was mostly centered in the staff and in people from intergovernmental relations and lobbies. So people who need this kind of information had it at hand. And the parliamentarian had these people at hand. So what we have is a very person-intensive process connected to the parliamentarian. They have in the chamber, in the lower house, we have up to 25 personal advisors to each parliamentarian. In the Senate, this number can reach 80 personal advisors to each senator. So it's a very person-intensive. So each parliamentarian has his or her own media advisor, has his or her own lawyer, has his or her own economist if he wants to. So there is a lot of people who benefits from this informational tools, and they advise the parliamentarian personally, directly. So what we do have now, and for example, how it works when we are in that mess that you saw, Professor Cristina, in the place, like 500 people just talking and ignoring what the speaker and the people making the speeches do. Well, if in a personal conversation with another parliamentarian, he wants to see, oh, and how is that bill again? Where is it? He will not check on the app. He will call someone who will check on the app for him. So I think what we have right now is an opportunity for parliamentarians to start using directly this technology and these applications and these tools. So because, well, if they are one of 513 screens, and if they have to stop listening, to call someone, to then have an answer, he probably or she probably will lose the opportunity to make his or her input. So I think they will start noticing the advantages of using directly the technology. On the other hand, the technology should be made more accessible for them. It's not so easily digested by them as it is right now. Precisely because it was not a one-off process. It was there were several steps, successive steps in this process. So, for example, if you show InfoLeg for someone who works on the chamber for maybe 8 or 10 years, and just to give you the precise number, I worked there for 18 years now. If you show InfoLeg for someone who is there for 8 or for example 5 years, it's much easier for them to find the information than for someone who just download the app and start using, because of the logics of the site that is reproduced in the app. So the same works for the parliamentarians. They should be well literated in this technology in a step-by-step process. It won't work, because it will always be easier to just ask someone who knows the answer or knows how to find the answer than to look for the answer themselves, if it's not something that they learn step by step.
Professor Cristina, before I pose you the same question, I'd like to read Marcos Civitaresi question as well, so you can comment on your remarks. He says, some people are saying that there is a lack of participation in the virtual parliament in Brazil. They said this because ordinary people cannot influence MPs directly or physically. He thinks this may be partly true, but at the same time, before the quarantine, there were already many virtual interactions, as Fabio shared, through social media, and I would add through other platforms in the house as well. What do you think of this issue in consonance with this question and with Fabio's remarks as well?
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting. And unfortunately, I could talk like for 10 hours about this. There's just so much to say. So I'm going to try to structure my comments at three levels, 3 key points, and I'll address Marcus' point also linked to that. So the first point, and I'll go through each one of them. The first point is that we are now on the 21st century. The type of parliament we have in the 21st century is what I call a mediator parliament, that mediates, from mediator, mediador. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Another one, which I think it's really important, and it's really clear in the comments that Fabio was making in terms of the availability of digital tools and who works with those and all that, it's the gap between the institution and the parliamentarian, which is an issue almost of governance of parliaments. Parliaments move as institutions, they don't always bring the MPs with them. So I'll come to that in a minute. So the gap between those two. And then finally, because it's sort of the result of all these things, it's the problems arising from a separation between what is in the UK called parliamentary business, so parliamentary activity, legislation, scrutiny, all of that. So separation between that and public engagement. And quite often, what we see is that Parliament's processes and the way they make those available are separate, are in parallel. They don't necessarily integrate, and there's lots of ways in how that's reflected. So I'll come back to that at the end, and that will answer more directly Marcus' question about people's participation. So the mediator parliament. One of the characteristics about Parliament today is that we have lots of pressures from society to participate, to have a say, to do something, and so people don't feel they can wait anymore every 4 years or 5 years for an election. People want to have a say every day about policies because they have, for lots of reasons, but if they have an opinion about health policy, they want to give their opinion about that. And that's a characteristic of our societies. We are very much more informed societies. We have access to lots of information. The internet provides us lots more than we would have done, say, the 20th century. So before the mediator parliament, what we had in the 19th century is what I call the gentleman's club parliament, which is a parliament very close, no relationships with society whatsoever. And, you know, the people who are within parliament are probably the same ones in government, the same ones who vote. You know, not everyone can vote. So it's a very closed system. When we moved to the 20th century, we developed the representative parliament, which is a parliament where people vote for MPs, deputies, vote for parties, and then those parties and those MPs, they go to the parliament and represent the people. And in that model, the idea of people participating every day just is not there. We provide the legitimacy to the MPs, to the deputies, because we vote for them and they act on our behalf. So the public trusts those people to make those decisions. But as we move into the 21st century, from the 70s and 80s onwards, you start seeing the development of participatory democracy. And we see that very clearly in Brazil with participatory budgets and all sorts of things. And people just want to participate. And so the idea that people don't participate anymore is just not there anymore. And so suddenly Parliament, and there's all sorts of these inputs coming from all over the place, and we still vote, we're still parties, but there's many other voices coming in. So civil society is much stronger. You have voices coming from all over the place. So parliaments are increasingly more and more the mediators between the whole system of society and the executive and government. And however, we still have a political class that still thinks in terms of the representative parliament model. So still thinks, I've been elected, I'm the one who knows. And that change from the representative to the mediator, it's still happening. I think in 50 years' time, we will have a better, we will have deputies who already assume that they have to listen, they have to include participation, they have to include all those things. But it's about the merging of those two different models that is still happening now. So that's one thing, is the context now of the mediator parliament, where we still have our traditional representative institutions, processes and structures, but we haven't adapted yet to bring all those things, although those things are already happening, and Brazilian is a good example of that. But we haven't changed the culture yet. We don't have, we haven't gone there yet. We haven't quite found how does a mediator parliament work. It's still in the early ages. And then this comes to the distinction between the institution and the parliament and the MP, the deputy. Again, it's a question of cultures, different cultures. But you have institutions who actually, and the Brazilian Congress is a very good example of that, which are incredibly well professionalized. They have very complex systems, very, very actually high-ranking staff, and they do a lot of work in facilitating all sorts of processes for the citizens, but that's not necessarily always followed by the deputies. So the deputies are not always taken with that. And we see institutions developing process, and you see that in the UK also, where the institution develops, say, these amazing participatory systems, but the deputies don't necessarily know about them, or are not necessarily using it because they're still doing their politics. And so that separation between the two of them then makes it difficult, them using that. And then I come back to my final point, which is the main one, which is a sort of a consequence of all the things I've said up till now, the 2 points, which is the separation between parliamentary business and public engagement. So a lot of the research that I've done has been to analyze how parliaments use public engagement. So when I say public engagement, it's about participation, asking the citizens, what do you think about this law? What do you think about this inquiry? What do you think about this? And getting those views in. And parliaments are slowly, but they are getting ways of doing that. The Brazilian Parliament, Brazilian Congress, I was amazed that now everything on the website is open for comment. So people can't say that they can't comment. Even the news on the website can have comments. So the channels are all there. Many other parliaments don't have as many channels. But what we see sometimes, and what my research has shown, is that sometimes you may have that input in there, but that doesn't mean that that's linked to the parliamentary activity. Meaning that doesn't mean that the deputies or even the clerks and all of that, that they're using that to inform the parliamentary activity. And that only happens every so often. So, and sometimes the change is not necessarily about understanding how to open participation, because to open participation, it's just the first step. Is about how to use that participation. So if the public is sending comments, then the issue is who is looking at that and what are they doing with that. So if there's lots of comments on a bill, that's fine, but who is actually looking at that? So even, for instance, if there's inquiries, I know you have interactive questions and all that. If people are putting questions and then they are being posed and then used for an inquiry, then that's a good example of integrating public engagement with parliamentary activity. But that sort of participation, of using that participation, is only starting, and it's not happening a lot yet in parliaments all across the world. This is not just Brazil, it's the next step. And that is different to the participation of just input of things. I usually say that public engagement is more than participation. Public engagement is about giving the people the information, and Fabio talked a lot about that, providing that information, making the information available, but then it's also making that information accessible and understandable to the public. So it's about having different guides or videos, infographics, different means of communicating. And then it's about opening for comments go in, but then there's a next step, which is the closing the feedback loop, which is what happens to those comments and how is that useful for the parliamentary business. And I think sometimes that's where the problem is, and that's how that's where the difficulties are, because it's very difficult to do that, because obviously deputies are politicians also, they have their own agendas, and it's not necessarily always that easy to use the input from the public. But so coming back to Marco's question about the participation, it's probably more about the visibility of how that's being used than anything else. Where is it going? So those comments might be coming in, but where are those? Who is looking at them, and what's happening to those? And I can understand that in a context like we are now, we're of crisis, where politics is not as normal, that those channels become even more invisible, because people might not necessarily know where they are or how they're being used. And apologies, because I've tried to condense in there lots and lots and lots of different thoughts, but I hope it made sense.
Thank you, Professor. Fabio, if you want to make quick comments on Professor Cristina's remarks.
Yes, I will actually, thanks, Professor, for all these very, very complex thoughts. It's hard to make it happen in such a short space of time. But specifically on the last point, I think, and I'm agreeing with what you said, that at least Brazilian Congress has been very proactive in broadcasting its information and opening channels, but is not actively listening to what people are saying. And if you don't have this active listening, if people just go there and post, comments, even if it's a rage comment, someone should be reading that and addressing and answering, or at least promoting the debate, and especially trying to find something useful for the draft of the bill, for example, some idea that could be further developed in the process. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are not still quite there. I think we should be more. We should focus in the near future in this part of this job of how to make people feel listened in the process, because then more people would join. Right now, you would only have those people who are first timers, because they discovered the tool and they find it interesting, go there and make a comment. And after not receiving any kind of feedback and any kind of response, they probably lose interest. And if you have a more active feedback from the institution, and particularly from the parliamentarians, you start to have more people engaged in this and via these tools. And
that's exactly what. That's exactly the point I was making, in terms of, if there's no feedback, if no one is listening, then people are not necessarily going to send things. And the case studies that I've studied, I've done lots of interviews of people who have submitted comments, and there's a really good quote that I have from one of my interviewees, which is, having thrown it was like throwing a ball into the ocean. Throw a ball into the ocean, it just disappears, and you don't know what happens to it. And the good examples of people who have been involved in those type of processes that were happy were the ones who actually had a response or felt someone was listening. Sometimes actually they don't achieve what they want, but it's just that feeling that there is someone listening, and institutions, parliament institutions can do far more on that. They are good examples, but there's more examples of that just not being there. So I totally agree with you.
Professor Cristina, Fabio, I will try to be more rigid with our time schedule. We have 6 minutes to the end, and we do have a few questions. But prior to that, I would like to make just one short comment on your last remark. There is a very interesting initiative on the Brazilian Senate. It's called e-Cidadania, or e-Citizenship. And they use this feedback on a peer-to-peer basis. So I can propose an idea, and this idea goes to an online platform, and my peers can vote if this idea is relevant or not. If it reaches 20,000 signatures, it goes to the Selected Committee of Human Rights and Participatory Legislation. So it's an interesting case we have here in Brazil that I would like to comment, because it also includes some offline tools, because otherwise only people with proper devices and proper connection would be able to make the remarks. But also they have a toll-free phone where anyone can call and ask for a public servant in the Senate to type down the legislative idea. But going to the questions, I would like to ask each one of you to make as short as possible on the answer, because we have 4 minutes to our deadline. We have Fernando Nascimento. I will direct this question to Fabio. Fabio, how can MPs and their staff can share their experience in this new technological scenario?
Well, there are a few ways. It's not very integrated yet, the lives with what's happening in the proper sessions, but I think that's a step that we'll see coming shortly. And I think the most useful way the parliamentarians are still using to share their experience is in their specific WhatsApp accounts, Instagram accounts, Facebook accounts, where they can share, unfortunately, with their own bubbles. And that I think is the next step, the next point that they want to change, how to expand this for a more comprehensive audience.
Professor Cristina, we have Thales Quintão asking a question. Again, I would ask you to be as short as you can. And please, Fabio, feel free to comment after that. He would like to know more about political dynamics, for instance, the agenda control, the coordination of projects, and delegation of power, how this current scenario has changed these processes, and what the MPs have been saying about this. Can you make your remarks focusing on what is happening on the UK, and Fabio focusing on what is happening here in Brazil, so we can have a better understanding on the differences?
Yeah, before I do my comment, I'll just say the Senate e-Cidadania is a system actually I know very well, and to me it's a good practice example, because there is lots of closing feedback, so it's an excellent example. In response to Pali's question, I'll say in terms of the UK, what has happened effectively is that I think that the political actors haven't changed. So the political actors making the decisions and the process, they're all still the same. What has changed, though, which has consequences to the politics, is that the business, so the parliamentary activity, has been restricted to a much smaller group of activities. So there's lots of things that the Parliament would usually do that they're not doing now. So they have limited the type of business that they do. So the parliamentary sessions, they're much shorter than they were. They only have a maximum of 2 hours. As you probably know, the UK, the constituency link is very important. There's lots of debates for that. As Salish know, I work a lot on petitions. There's petitions debates. There's lots of things important that are just not happening. And so that's the main consequences of the current environment, is that we don't really have the same politics happening. Who has the power and who has the control is still the same people. And the UK, the government really dominates those processes.
Fabio?
Yes, just really quick comments. In Brazil, as we said before, the committees are on hold. So, and there is no public hearings, for example, and that's very important part of process, which is not happening. So it's there are some similarities here. As far as the coordination of projects and delegation of power, that's mostly on the hands of the speakers here in Brazil, and they are not really willing to share with anyone in this moment. So they are very restricted in the ways they build the list of projects, list of bills, which will be submitted to the plenary. So it's even more control to the speakers now.
Thank you, Fabio. Professor Cristina, if you want to make your closing remarks, feel free to do this.
Before I do closing remarks, I'll just say that it's really interesting that you say committees are not meeting, and that so there's no hearings happening, because in the UK it's exactly the opposite. So if anything, committees are working far more than they ever have, and actually because they're meeting virtually, they're finding that they can have more witnesses coming to talk to them, so they can have people from all over the country, and it's not, it's easy to organize and all of that. In terms of final remarks, I'll just say that when we're thinking about virtual parliaments, we should always remember that it's not just about digital, it's also about the fact that we're dealing with a crisis. And that by itself brings other factors in terms of emergency, in terms of how to move forward. And so the digital is there as the means to provide for institutions to meet, but it's not the end of it. It's not the end product. It's just something that facilitates and can bring more opportunities. And I hope that's enough as closing remarks. I don't know how long you wanted me to talk about, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Professor Cristina. Fabio, feel free to make your closing remarks as well.
Yes, I would just to use the digital way. I retweet everything Professor Cristina said, and just add that it's very. As we are doing this in the middle of a crisis, it's not an incremental process anymore. The digital is not only the extra, it's not only another way, it has become the main way or the unique way we are able to do parliaments right now, and that changed the experience, and that will influence the way we understand this process in the future.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you all for watching and debating with us about this particular theme. Just our usual reminder, this webinar is produced and created by Bússola Tech. Our partners are FENALegis, ITS Rio, Sindilegis, and Swiss Next Brazil, with institutional support from the Brazilian Senate, the City Council of São Paulo, the Legislative Institute of São Paulo, Colabi, Radar Governamental, Elegis, and Brasa. Thank you, Professor Cristina. It was an honor to debate with you today. And thank you, Fabio, for your time. We were deeply honored to receive your remarks as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.